Hey guys, it's Keith. I'm here today to take this online quiz on individual differences research labs.com, IDR Labs. And I'm doing this because I think this kind of topic is so fraught and overblown, and I don't like how I feel when I censor myself or suppress what are fundamentally very normy, typical, average perspectives. I think radicals have taken over this kind of conversation and redefined the Overton window of acceptable commentary, and I find myself struggling internally, and maybe that sounds like a bit strong, but it's very real. If you're an expressive person and you like to think about things, it's not cool to feel like you're not allowed to say them. So this is a transgender attitude test, and I'm going to go through this and just talk through what I consider to be very acceptable, fair points. I'm not an expert on this topic. I'm an artist and a writer and a flinter, and I've been around and I've seen a lot of news and met a lot of people, and I know trans people, and I've lived in major cities that are very accepting of this my whole life, from LA and New York and Berlin and beyond. And I just want to share some thoughts thinking through these questions with you guys. So let's get into this. This is the Transgender Attitude test on idealabs.com. There's 26 questions, and let's get through them. Question 1. Transgender people have a right to be addressed by the pronouns of their choice. So this was a big thing when I was in Berlin, living there in like 2018 or so, 16, 18. I mean, this topic has been growing, and I think it's even subsiding now. It's 2024 as I record this. So I've been talking about this and podcasting about it for many years already, but it's still this kind of inflammatory topic. And this is a reason why this kind of question gets at what I think are real questions, like whose rights are we protecting and whose responsibilities are we demanding? So to have the right to be addressed by something is like a funny phrasing of this concept of rights. There's no such thing as rights, first of all. It's not like a real thing. It's a concept that we've made up. So human rights are something that I certainly believe in. I've been an advocate of civil rights and human rights worldwide, even to this day, as a lifelong leftist, even though I'm now like kind of redefining myself as a centrist. I definitely appreciate this concept of rights, and I take the right to my freedom of speech very seriously. To be addressed by something is a weird way of phrasing that. It reminds me of how, like, living in Europe, there's less freedom of speech. Like, there's more phrases and concepts that are banned, and photography on the streets is harder to pull off than in somewhere like New York. But there's more of a right to dignity. And so this would fall under there. Like, people have a right to dignity. And this is kind of a clash of values. I'm more on this side of expression than I'm on the side of repression. And I think that while this question sounds like it's advocating for this expression of trans people to decide their own pronouns, I take it more as a sign of repressing my freedom to say whatever I want. When we're angry at each other, we can call each other names. When we have these kind of complex negative emotions like sadness and anger, we lash out and we say things. And, you know, there is such thing as hate speech. I don't think this should be stifled. I think people should be allowed to hate each other. This is not even going that far. This is simply like demanding that someone uses certain words. And I think that kind of compelled speech is a problem. So I remain like very ambivalent about this kind of question, because I don't really know. It feels like a slippery slope. It feels like something that someone starts me on and then follows suit that I have to do something. And I don't have to do something. I don't have to do anything. I choose to refrain from slurs. I don't call people names. I don't like ad hominem attacks rhetorically. And so I do use the preferred pronouns of transgender people that I know because they present that way and it's socially proper in terms of etiquette and sociability to do that. But I don't know if it's their right. Just as I'm not like saying that it's my right to be called, whatever I want to make up. Now, I mean, it's just kind of like identity is like a two-way street. You don't just get to decide what you are and say it. Like, I'm not a doctor. I can't just say, call me Dr. Keith from now on, because I'm not a doctor. You have to go through certain steps to become a doctor. And I think there are requisites to being called a certain pronoun as well. Obviously, being born biologically kind of is how most of us relate to our own pronouns. But I do give room for people to change their pronouns. Like, that's okay with me. But it becomes this kind of cudgel or weapon when the rest of us are told that we also have to use our pronouns explicitly, like in our Instagram bios or on our email sign-offs. And I think that's a real problem. And I think it comes from this sort of logic that starts with this really innocuous question. Don't people have a right to be addressed by the pronouns of their choice? Well, no, not really. Like, I don't have a right to be described by the adjectives of my choice. You get to decide how you think about me. So if I want to describe myself as curious and expressive, you might think, no, you're a know-it-all loudmouth and you're arrogant. Like, you get to decide that. And I don't have much ground to stand on to say that you're alienating me and my rights and that you're committing hate speech. Like, this whole, like, this is like the real problem I have with this topic. Like, this whole concept of conflating hate versus dignity into language and the words that we use, it's like, it's a bit fraught. So basically, I'm going to answer here that I slightly disagree with this. It's not that I don't want to participate in this world in which people can choose their gender. Like, I'm happy to participate in that world. I do live there. But I wouldn't describe it as a right. Other people get to partake in how I'm seen as a person. Question 2. The higher average poverty rates of transgender people attest to the inherent unfairness of capitalism. Well, that's quite a big question. Capitalism produces unfair results, as does every system, even communism, which explicitly states that its goal is to not do that. It still happens. Life's not fair, period. I don't know why this has turned into a capitalism diatribe. It's this kind of neo-Marxist thing of making everything about oppressors and oppressed. There are poverty rates higher in a myriad of different identity groups. The poverty rates of Nigerians versus Black Americans of slavery descent are totally different. And it's hard to know why that is exactly. So I don't really give in to blanket statements like this because they're too pat, they're too convenient of a one idea answer, and this is not as simple as that. Poverty rates of transgender people. I could easily explain this differently. I think that transgender people have much higher rates of depression. Depressed people are much less productive in the world. industrious people are more rich, less industrious or productive people are more poor. I mean, that's a much easier explanation than to simply lay it at the feet of capitalism. I'm very sympathetic to this. I struggle with mental issues like depression and anxiety and attention deficit disorder and insomnia and on and on. But I don't blame capitalism. It would be a lot more convenient for me if capitalism rewarded this kind of work and that, the YouTube algorithm was more friendly. But it is what it is. Things are not fair. You have to kind of fight your way, and that's life. So I disagree with this. I'm wondering if I should fully disagree or if I should just partially disagree like I did last time. I'm going to fully disagree. I mean, the thing is that the second half of this I kind of agree with. Like, capitalism is unfair, but it produces fair opportunities more than any other system. So it depends on how you define fairness. Is it equal opportunity of outcome or equal opportunity of, or is it opportunity of outcome? Sorry, is it equality of outcome or is it equality of opportunity? And I think capitalism does create an equality of opportunity for a lot of people, more so than any other system. But it nonetheless does feel unfair to so many of us. Okay, 3. If society were more accepting, transgender people would on average be just as happy with their lives as non-transgender people. What a mouthful, non-transgender people. So this is kind of similar to the last one. Society is like, replace capitalism with society. Life's not fair. Society accepts a lot. I'm kind of responding here to what I perceive as a very accepting wave throughout the West about this topic of transgenderism. It's hard for me to see where trans people are not accepted, because in the big cities that I've inhabited, it's explicitly the case that they're not only accepted, but celebrated and even prioritized in terms of attention and, deference of opinion and taste and etiquette. I feel like we're tiptoeing around this topic, and that's, I don't know, like, I've heard plenty of other, trans people are not a monolith, right? There are some trans people that would rather not have this kind of attention and to just be treated normally. And then there are others that are more activist oriented who very much bludgeon us with a demand to accept them even more and to do all these things in order to accept them. I might refer to this kind of trans person more often throughout this video, but that's not to say that there's a spectrum of people. Obviously there is. But I'm more kind of reacting right now to what I feel is like a very vicious activist movement on the behalf of trans people. And I don't think it's very cool. And this kind of comment, I just don't know if I can agree with this, because to be transgender is to be at odds with yourself. Kind of by definition, right? I'm sure we'll get into the science stuff here, but like, my take is one that has been just accepted as normal forever. You're born a biological sex and you identify with that sex and sexuality to some degree. And to be trans is to have dysmorphia and to not identify with your body at all. And that sounds very, very depressing. And it's no wonder that people with body dysmorphia feel less, one with the world. They're not accepting of themselves. So how can you expect society? Like, you cannot blame society when you're the one that doesn't accept yourself, right? And that's not meant as an attack or a judgment, because I can relate. I struggle, but I have to accept who I am fundamentally. And it's to turn that around and bully everyone else to contort their vision of things to my dysmorphia is wrong. And I just can't agree with this. But of course, I think that there's some goodness. Obviously the left is coming from a very compassionate place when it wants to help trans people by making society even more accepting. That's a good intuition, but I think it can go a little too far. It's like the mother bear protecting its cub and slashing the picnicker or something like this. I don't know. Of sure, if society were accepting of every single thing, then everybody would be happier with their lives. I suppose that's like kind of a truism in there, so I'm not going to fully disagree, but ultimately I think it's errant to go down this path. 4. If transgender people don't want to transition through surgery, etc., that shows that they're just bluffing to get attention. I'm not going to make that assumption. I don't know if that's always the case or how often it is the case. I'm sure that it's the case sometimes. I'm sure that there are stories. We were told, on the left wing of politics, we were told that this is ridiculous, that no one is going to take advantage of this, and there's no men that are just going to pretend to be trans in order to have access to this and that. But that is happening. That is the case. In prisons, women are getting pregnant because there are trans women in prison. In sports, women are getting beaten and beat physically and literally and metaphorically because there are trans women that are competing against them. And in bathrooms and restrooms and public safe spaces for women, there are attacks and molestations and sex crimes. And these things do happen. I'm not I know this sounds like some sort of right-wing dog whistle, not even dog whistle, just like on its face, like this is like a talking point on the right. Probably. I don't consume right-wing media. But yeah, that does happen. It doesn't mean that every trans person is like that, obviously. But some are bluffing. And I think there are plenty of narcissists in this community. I think this whole topic of autogynephilia is a thing within the trans community, and that's like this kind of attraction to yourself and wanting to be desirable to yourself and wanting to demand that you are taken as desirable. Like how lesbian spaces are infiltrated with chicks with dicks, to put it vulgarly. If you have male sex organs, you're male, and you can call yourself a woman, and I will abide socially, and I'll hang out with you, and I would work with you, no problem. But I'm not gonna agree with this per se. I think this is a little too conservative of a take. If trans people don't want to transition through surgery, that shows they're just bluffing. I think trans needs to be thought of more as I want to kind of say a phase. It's kind of like lesbianism within college age. Like people experiment, and if I was a kid nowadays, I might experiment with this because I was a very expressive adolescent. I dyed my hair. I was very punk. I dressed very outrageously in these gaudy ska punk clothes, and so this kind of movement would have attracted me because it's so anti-establishment. But that doesn't mean that I never want to have kids or that I, won't be more in touch with my male sexual prowess one day. That was a phase, and I would have been offended if you said it at the time, but adults kind of see it for what it is sometimes. Now, again, like this isn't always a phase. Obviously, there are trans people that are very literally going through all the legit experiences of needing to transition and then transitioning and then being happier, etc. So I'm not going to agree, but I'm not going to disagree either, because I do think some of this is attention getting. I do think, well, it's hard to say. This is like a very thorny topic in terms of psychology, and I don't want to go down this road entirely. I also want to pick up the pace here, so I'm going to stay neutral here. 5, transgender people should be required to use the public restrooms of the gender they were born with. This is also too conservative for me. I think pre-gay marriage and marriage equality in the Obama years, this was the kind of thing that just passed by without comment. And I'm sure that, trans men have shared restrooms with me. I know trans women who surely belong in the women's restroom. If they still have a penis, it's complicated, and I might not be the one to make a stance on that topic because it's not my space. But I do have sympathy for women who feel threatened by that. I don't think that you can just call them ignorant or closed-minded. I think the penis is a powerful organ that, sometimes has a mind of its own, as people kind of say. So, yeah, I would get around this with architecture and ingenuity. I would make private stalls for every place, and then make the washing up part, kind of shared. Everyone deserves to take their pants off in a private cubicle, and there's no reason why, especially in the US, we need these really flimsy cubicles that you can walk right under, that barely lock. This is a little silly. I really have a lot of reference for spaces that provide proper doors and privacy for when nature calls. So I don't agree with this at all, to be honest with you. Well, I guess I'll slightly disagree because I do have sympathy but I don't agree. I'll just slightly disagree. 6, giving puberty blockers to gender dysphoric children is a good idea. My attitude about this at the moment is that this is not a good idea. And the reason I think that is because puberty blockers, from what I've more recently read, are not as pleasant sounding as this euphemism would suggest. They don't just simply block puberty. It's not like an IUD for birth control where you can just put something in your body, you're good for a while, and then if you change your mind, you take it out. It's not like that. It doesn't just block the puberty. It's not like a beta blocker in your mind that stops certain synapses. Puberty blockers are hormone drugs that literally prevent certain hormones from developing or growing, like testosterone. This is something that this is given to sex offenders to chemically castrate them. I'm not sure if they're the exact same thing, but chemical castration and puberty blockers, they're kind of in the same space. And this is very detrimental to give to children growing up because it kind of, it obliterates their fecundity and virility for their lives. It doesn't just pause it. I think Michael Schellenberger puts it well. If we're going to talk about rights, I think that every individual has the right to go through puberty. And even that's putting it strongly in terms of my last discussion on rights as a concept. But I think that that's valid. That I like that more. Puberty is something that we all take for granted. And it, by the way, it sucks for most of us. Puberty was not fun. I definitely felt super awkward and alienated from myself and the world when I was going through puberty. So I can appreciate that people are kind of kicking and screaming through this process, but nonetheless, I don't think it's a good idea. I think this should be taken very seriously, and I think the medical establishment is jumping into this way too casually because of political pressure. And this is kind of what I'm talking about. We're living in this wave of hysteria, this wave of this moral panic about how to handle this topic because it's so delicate and some people are so offended by it. But I feel personally bullied. My inclination to agree with this kind of comment is coming from a bullied place. I fear the repercussions if I was to try and get a job or if I was, facing off against an activist, I would feel very afraid of their wrath. And I don't think that they're wielding their power very nicely. I don't think that blocking the puberty of confused adolescents is the way here. There are some adolescents that ought to transition, perhaps prior to puberty. I'm thinking of one of my favorite hyper pop stars, Kim Petras, who, I'm very attracted to her. She's a hot girl and she's trans, and she transitioned very young. I keep her in mind because, like, someone like her, she's living a successful life from what I can tell. I mean, obviously, as a public figure, I'm sure it's more complicated than that. But I'm not saying that no children should have puberty blockers, but it should not be easy to do this. Right now, there are laws about like circumnavigating parental consent. There are laws about, jumping right into this from a therapeutic perspective, skipping talk therapy, skipping other drugs, going straight to surgery. I mean, this is really not the way, in my opinion. I'm going to fully disagree. Even though I do want to leave room for some cases, but it needs to be really talked through. 7, a person should be at least 18 years of age before starting hormone therapy with the aim of switching their gender. I mean, this makes more sense to me. Like, again, this is why I think of my ideas and views as pretty normie. Like, this is how we treat almost everything. We treat this, we have an age restriction on most things, including movies, tattoos and piercings. If you can't get a tattoo, why are you allowed to cut off a body part? You know what I mean? Like, it is like that simple. It doesn't really make sense that we allow this. So I guess I agree with this. Now, again, you can have a rule like this and still get around it, right? I mean, we have a drinking limit age in the US of 21, but there are ways around that. And I think it's good that there are ways around it. I think savvy people that definitely want to drink and have fun, as I did as a teenager, and 21, that's like junior year of college. That's kind of crazy if you think about that. So obviously alcohol is accessible, and I think that these gender steps, these trans steps to switching gender, should also be accessible without being too accessible, if you know what I mean. 8, whether someone is a man or a woman is determined by the sex they were born with. I'm not going to fully agree with this. Like I've kind of said, I think if this was phrased, whether someone is male or female is determined by the sex they were born with, I would fully agree with that, because biologically that's what I've learned, and I stand by my AP bio class from high school. Biological sex is real. I don't feel like I'm saying anything hateful or wrong there. But being man or woman, like, I was really into this discussion on trans topics in regard to separating gender from biological sex, and I'm still there. Like, I'm happy to separate those things. So if you want to say that you're something that you're not biologically sexed as, that's okay with me. Again, I'm fine with calling, if I had a very close friend who was a trans man and he hung out with us as a group of guys, I'd be like, all right, guys, like, all right, men, let's do, like, I'd be fine with that. I accept people. It's more often the case the other way, right? Like, it depends on the age, but I would accept a woman being a woman even if she was born a male, being born a boy. I would accept her that way. That doesn't mean that I have to be sexually attracted to her. That doesn't mean anything else. It just means that I accept that she can define her own gender. It doesn't even mean that I have to use the pronoun. It just means that I'm fluid enough with separating gender from sex. So I'll slightly disagree. I'm not going to fully disagree because obviously, I mean, does this even need to be said? Like, over 99% of us do identify with the gender assigned at birth, as the sex assignment was such a confusing, clunky phrase, assigned at birth, as if the doctor decides what biological sex you are. I mean, there are primary and secondary sex characteristics, and the organ between your legs is correlated almost entirely with your biological sex. So, with exception of rare instances of intersex and hermaphroditic individuals, I think most of us do identify with the gender of our sex. So I'm not going to fully disagree with this. 9, privately owned schools should be able to refuse transgender students if they so desire. Privately owned schools, I mean, this is a really tricky topic. This is, again, like when I think about rights, I think like with the gay marriage thing, like it's not gay rights, it's marriage rights. It's the right to marry. It's not the right to be gay. Like you can be gay. Before you couldn't. There are places where you cannot be gay. But like the fight during the Obama administration in the US and beyond was for equal access to marriage. Okay. Now, here it would be equal access to an education. And if this said public schools should be able to refuse, I would say no. Like everybody deserves an access to education, no matter what. I don't care how troubled or confused you are or what sort of issues you have going on. And I say that compassionately. You have a right to an education in the US and the West. And I believe in that. But I also believe in the right of a private enterprise to do what it wants. As an individual, I'm allowed to do what I want. And it's tricky with a private school because education is a big deal. Homeschooling is a thing, right? So like if you're homeschooling a child, you're allowed to limit that school, in quotes, to just your child. You're not mandated to take on everybody in the neighborhood if you're a homeschool teacher. You're allowed to run your business as you like if it's a small enough business. Now, if it's a huge business, a corporation, then that's a little different. And this is like where government intervention and regulations come into play. Like it's hard to say how much this should be regulated on this topic. It's complicated. So I don't have a strong impulse here, but I would say in general that private institutions are allowed to do what they want. You're not allowed into every private institution. I mean, we have these rules in the US of like protected identity groups, like your race and your gender and your sexual orientation. These are discrimination laws that make some sense, right? Like you shouldn't be allowed to, you shouldn't be prohibited from working at a place because of your race. That makes sense to us. But a place is allowed to refuse service to anyone it wants. I've seen that sign everywhere. We have the right to refuse service, and it usually applies to, assholes, basically. Like you're going to get kicked out if you don't behave right in the world. And I think that's okay. I think that that's a fair thing for an institution to say. Now, this isn't about refusing education to assholes. This is about refusing education to transgender students, and that seems like a dick move to me. But it might be within their rights. I'm not sure. I'm going to stay neutral. It really depends on how large the institution is. If it's like Harvard or Yale, like a private university that's enormous, like maybe not, right? But if it's like just a small little charter school that's like Christian or religious, like maybe it has that right. I guess I'll slightly disagree, but I have a lot of libertarian tendencies toward agreeing, but I'm still going to slightly disagree. 10. Society has gone too far in supporting and accepting transgender people. I think so, guys. I really, I'm sorry to say that, but this happened, around 2018 or so, like when I felt compelled to put my pronouns in Instagram. This was such a turning point because so many of my friends in Berlin are of that space, this kind of, leftist activist space. And I think that's going too far in supporting trans people. Like, I accept trans people. Like, if a trans person or anybody wants to put their pronouns in their bio, that's all good. Like, that's fine. You're allowed to put anything you want in your own bio. But for this sweeping movement of everybody should, in order to make this political point of acceptance, like, that's authoritarianism. Don't you see that? Like, that's tyrannical to me. Just because you accept it in a happy way doesn't mean that it's not tyrannical. It's Brave New World to me. And we see that everywhere. I don't want this to be such an issue. Like, I don't have to put my height and weight everywhere. I don't have to put my religion everywhere. Like, why is this one thing such a thing? And I'm happy to say, I think nowadays it's dying down a bit, but this has swept through corporate America. It has swept through industries that I'm adjacent to, like media and the arts and journalism. And I think it's just insane how hysterical people are on this topic. I think it's gone too far. Now, this depends on how you define society. I'm defining it by these kind of institutions, these kind of woke washing tech companies, for instance. Obviously, there's a contingent of conservatives that push back on that, and they're certainly part of society as well. So that whole Bud Light thing, Kid Rock and everyone like saying they'll never drink Bud Light again, that's also society. But I would say in general, like, I would say yes. I think it's kind of, in my world, it's very evident. Maybe that's my bubble, but I would say it's definitely the case. I mean, look, we're debating whether or not it's okay to talk about biological sex. That's too far. We are kicking people off Twitter, or we were before Elon Musk bought it. We are deplatforming professors and others, so to me, like, there are obvious signs of society going too far. That's what I would say. 11. Someone who isn't transgender will never be able to understand what it's like to live as a transgender person. Therefore, the views of transgender people should count for more when discussing transgender issues. This lived experience argument. It is the case that none of us can fully understand the other. But that's why we have the arts. That's why we have literature and cinema. That's why we listen to each other, and we have this thing called sympathy. And my sympathetic senses are active. I've read several books on the topic of trans people, not academic books, but Middle Sex by, I think it was Eugenides. That chronicles, that's like a great American novel about an intersex person. And it's, it's a decent book. It's a bit too long, but the first half is great. The first quarter is great. It's a slog, but I've read that, and I've related to this experience of living through this protagonist's life. Tranny, offensive word, I guess, but that's the name of the book, by this trans woman who is the singer of a punk rock band, Against Me. I've read that. It's kind of the memoir of somebody that's gone through a transition and struggled throughout their life as someone with dysmorphia that flamed up here and there. So I can appreciate where trans people are coming from. Like, just as I can appreciate where you're coming from within 1 minute of you talking to me and telling me your story. This happens all the time on the political trail, it's not that hard for us to sympathize with one another. It's like a human capacity to do that. So I don't appreciate being told in this weaponized way that I'll never understand. I don't appreciate being told that. What do you mean? Are you doubting my capacity for sympathy? Are you doubting my capacity for imagination? I can understand and think about what it's like to be a dog, okay? A different species I can try and understand. So don't tell me that I can't understand body dysmorphia. I've felt at odds with my body here and there. We all have, when we feel overweight or inferior in some way. I have more of a belly and less of a chest than I would like. Obviously, it's not the same, obviously. But I don't feel perfectly at home in my body all the time. All right. So, insofar as that is the fundamental point here, I can understand that. All right. So, I don't like this kind of comment that I'm looking at and reading because, again, it's a tactic used for power. So many of these kind of phrases of like, wouldn't you say I have the right to be addressed? Well, like, you're just going to use that for more power. That's what's happening. And I don't sign off on that. I'm not vibing with that. It's not cool. It's a power game. And I'm not playing this narcissistic power game. Therefore, the views of transgender. I mean, obviously, like, substitute black in here and you have BLM, substitute woman in here and you have Me Too. And again, like, these movements have purpose and there are inequities and wrongs that should be corrected. But playing this kind of power game is not the way to do it, in my opinion. I don't know if I'm slightly disagreeing or fully because, like, look, obviously lived experience does count for something in addition to what I'm doing here, which is philosophy and rhetoric. I mean, I think rational people in a rational society can get to the right answers no matter who they are, but lived experience does count for something. So I don't want to fully ignore that. I just don't want it to be used as like this shut down, trump card. 12. Hate speech against transgender people should be illegal, even if no specific individuals are named or threatened. I fully disagree. I think all hate speech should be legal, to be honest with you. I'm not going to call myself a free speech absolutist because there are exceptions to everything, but I'm allowed to hate who I want, and so are you. And I think this whole goal of cleaning up a place like Twitter to make sure no one is offended or to like deplatform people on campuses because no one should be offended, I think that's insane. I think that's coddling and unproductive and against the psychological principles of being strong and adaptive and persevering. The world is going to come at you guys. It's going to come at you, and you can't just criminalize it. You have to take your lumps. You have to become adjusted. You have to become strong and in yourself. And it's not society's job to make a fragile, weak world just because you are. 13. The state has a responsibility to further research into sex transitioning so that transgender people can receive functional sex organs of the gender they identify as. Wow, that's quite the claim. That is such a bold, arrogant demand. Wow. I mean, look, we should all be so lucky to have the state fund and explore the scientific breakthroughs that we want. I would love that too. I would love to live forever, and the state should be researching it for me. So sexual reassignment surgery, bottom surgery and top surgery, very colloquially, euphemistically called. I mean, mastectomies and vaginoplasty or penis removement, reconstructing penises out of like the skin on your arm. Like, this stuff is rudimentary. This stuff is nascent. This is not the best we'll do. Medical technology will surely improve, but right now it's not very good. I've read enough very eye-opening and vile things online about the realities of genital surgeries, and it is essentially mutilation, in my opinion. I'm not going to go so far as to say it should be a criminal offense, that the doctors that butcher such people should be locked up. I'm not going to say all that, but you are never, I'm sorry, you're just not going to make a penis or a vagina as well as nature does. I mean, good fucking luck to the scientists and doctors out there. It's going to take a long time before designer surgical vagina is as good as the real thing. It's never going to connect to the uterus and the fallopian tubes. It's never going to make its own ovaries. It's not going to happen. I mean, I shouldn't say never. I'm sure there will be some other brave new worlds in the future where we have these kind of sex robots that you can actually make babies with. But that's, I mean, you want that? Do you really want that? Functional sex organs, this is why it's such a big deal to deny puberty or to take puberty blockers or to make these kind of decisions on people that don't have fully developed brains. Your sex organs that you're born with are a gift. I mean, that's a little much. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us have experienced a lot of, conflict and tension with our sexualities. But essentially, the ability to reproduce is, it's an ability that a lot of us have. And we mess with that at our own peril. I'll say that. And on this topic of medical insurance, you can't even get dental insurance covered by the state, let alone sexual reassignment. Teeth are a big deal. They fall out, they rot, they experience pain, and most insurance plans don't even cover that. So if you're saying that, not only should it be affordable, but that it should be guaranteed to you that you have not only current levels of sex organ technology, but the functioning in the best version, and that the state should pay for. I mean, it's just an insane thing to say. I mean, dream on. Fully disagree. 14. Hate crimes against transgender people are a bigger problem than transgender advocacy itself. Hate crimes are bad. Bullying. I mean, look, I think the bullying is coming from the advocacy. Actual violence, like punching and kicking and killing, that does happen. I mean, I'm not thinking of any name. Maybe I'm a little out of touch in that way. I haven't heard of a trans person getting killed recently. When I was growing up in the 90s, I remember a name called Matthew Shepard, who was a gay teenager who was killed violently in the US South. And that was a big rallying cry for the gay movement. And I was fully on board with that. I haven't heard about that happening in recent memory, but I'm sure it has. I'm not even sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it has. I do remember the movie Boys Don't Cry from the 90s or 2000s, which was it's a great movie. Hilary Swank plays a trans person. She's a female who presents as a man, and she has buddies who, spoiler alert, do find out she's trans, and they attack her. That's a really complex story that's told very well, back to the sympathy and understanding point. The thing for me, and I might sound a little autistic or something here, but to me, it's a bigger problem when we have mass media and social media kind of propagating these bullying ideas to everybody. I think this low thud of bullying people like me into progressive ideology, regressive in my opinion, this low din of that is worse than very specific attacks on individuals. Now, for those individuals, obviously being attacked is worse. Being killed is worse than being pressured into your pronouns. But the fact that all of us, broadly speaking, are being pressured in these ways and being told that we're bad people if we don't fully agree, that's worse to me. That's worse to me. So I would say that no, the hate crimes against transgender people, however many dozen there are not a bigger problem than the very loud, outspoken, and bullying activism of transgender advocacy. That's my opinion. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad guy. It doesn't mean that I hate trans people. It doesn't mean that I'm phobic. It just means that I think that the tenor of this discussion is being held hostage by extremists who push for transgender advocacy. "15. Being transgender is a mental disorder." Well, look, I know this is a hot take, but I do think so. It's not that I think so. It's that I know, based on the definition of words, that it is. Now, mental disorder, like, that's I'm in counseling. I am not I'm not a trained psychologist or psychiatrist. I'm not meant to make diagnoses, but diagnoses are made, and we call these kind of issues mental disorders. Maybe it's a little uncouth to say that about something like insomnia or borderline personality disorder or whatever you want, but that is what it is, and I have sympathy for that because I have my own mental issues. Body dysmorphia is a mental disorder. Being transgender, to my knowledge, means having body dysmorphia. If you don't have dysmorphia with your own body, if you're born a male and you don't have dysmorphia about that, you're not a girl. You are practicing fashion. You are being, you're being contrarian. You're being radical for the sake of it, which is fine. But don't tell me that don't tell me that this is not a mental disorder. That body dysmorphia, that's what it is, technically. And I have sympathy. I mean, a lot of my sympathies for transgender, people, I guess, but I'm trying to make room for advocacy. I do think that certain things should happen in order to help trans people. Redesigning bathrooms, for instance. But it's the same that being in a wheelchair is a physical disorder. It's not a judgment to say that. What do we do about that? Well, let's put in ramps. It's the same. Let's make space for trans lives, for sure. But that doesn't mean that you have to infringe on other people's lives. So with sports, maybe we need another kind of trans category. I don't know. I don't really think about sports regulations very deeply, so I'm not the person to weigh in on that per se. But I hear the complaints of actual women, and those matter to me. Again, put a ramp into a building for a handicapped person, a paraplegic. At the state are you gonna remove certain buildings because they can't be accessed that way? That would be probably too far. You shouldn't be demolishing buildings just because they don't have elevators, right? I mean, it's a give and take, but it is a mental disorder. I'm not going to fully agree because it doesn't use the phrase body dysmorphia. It just says transgender. So being transgender, again, it could be a fad. You could be a teenager who's super cool, and you could be calling yourself transgender or calling yourself they, them without doing anything else about it. And you probably do not have a mental disorder. You probably just are really cool. So yeah, it's not always the case. I don't even know if you are transgender, but you're somehow gender fluid or some other thing, right? 16. There are only two genders. I don't really appreciate this point of view that much. There are two biological sexes. That's what there are. And that is a truism in the animal kingdom that goes way beyond guys and gals of humans. Two genders, I'm not gonna die on this hill. Again, I make room for other gender bending, femboys, the third sex. I'd be happy with three genders at least: man, woman, other. Some, if we're going by language, a lot of cultures would go by man, woman, and child. Child being a kind of neutered non-gender because they're not sexually productive, right? So I think this is a weird, limiting way to look at the world. It's a conservative take for sure. I know where it's coming from because it's talking about biological sex, but I think to agree with this, you would have to agree that gender follows biological sex all times, and it usually does. It usually does. So I have sympathy for this point of view, but not always. So I'll slightly disagree. I mean, I can easily disagree because I see how many damn genders are listed on places like Facebook or whatever. Like, if you can make up 100 genders, there are obviously more than two. You can't make up 100 different biological sexes. So you see the difference there. 17. Businesses that provide wedding services should be able to refuse service to couples where one or both of them identify as transgender. This is back to like the rights of independent properties and institutions. And my thoughts are really complex here. You know, this wedding services thing reminds me of this story back in the day of a wedding cake. There was a gay couple that was suing a bakery because they refused to make a wedding cake for this gay wedding. And this was a big news story. It turns out that the gay couple in question was like really looking for trouble. Like they were going to many bakeries and being very flamboyant, if you will, and trying to make this a story. Like find a religious bakery, a religious owned institution, provoke them into refusing service, and then sue them and make a big news story out of it. And those sound like jerks to me, those guys. But the thing is, like, look, I support gay marriage. I support, my best friends are gay, like three of them. I'm in gay spaces a lot. But that doesn't mean that you're allowed to do whatever, whenever you want to, right? Like a gay pride parade, if you're going to bring children there, you probably shouldn't be fisting each other on a float. You know what I mean? It doesn't make me homophobic to say that. In this regard, it's just that it goes both ways. Like you guys can imagine, my leftist friends, some MAGA backwoods, militia guy who you really dislike, you disdain him. And if you run a business, if you're a photographer, are you demanded by the government to provide services to this guy? No, you shouldn't have to, right? Like within reason, like you, as a proprietor, you reserve the right to refuse service. So yeah, it's the gay wedding cake all over again. If it's Walmart or Target or McDonald's or some huge corporation, this should not be an issue. Like, you're not allowed to refuse business like that, per se. But if you're, like, literally working out of your kitchen and you're, like, taking your wares or your baked goods or something to the farmer's market, like, you have a right to say, like, you know what, I don't think that you're gonna respect my vegetables as much as the next guy, so actually I'm not gonna sell my whole lot to you. Like, it's a complex situation. It's like society's complicated, but like I don't appreciate these kind of. I mean, this is a bullying tactic that's disguising itself as a victimizing tactic. It's like a classic narcissistic move to be like, we're victims because they won't do what we want them to do for us. Like, there are plenty of other people that will. Go find them. You know what I mean? Like, unless it's a very niche thing, if it's like an energy utility or a credit card, like that's where we're talking about trouble. Like we have credit card companies right now that refuse bank access to Canadian truckers because they might be conservatives. That's a problem. You know what I mean? So this doesn't even qualify on the same level. I slightly agree with this. But, I wouldn't do it. I would be happy to provide wedding services for transgender couples. That's no problem for me. I'm just saying, like, if you think about, like, the free market and libertarian principles, that's where I'm coming from here, to slightly agree. I'm going to stay neutral, actually, because I, as their friend or someone else commenting, I would say just do it. You know, like why give your political enemy the win on that? 18. Private employers should be free to not hire transgender people if doing so clashes with their convictions. It's the exact same question. Private employers. I mean, I could be a private employer. You know, I file taxes as an independent, self-employed person. If I hired an assistant, I'm allowed to hire whoever I want. I'll have to probably make up some other reason, as we all do, right? But I'm gonna disagree. I would need to seek a case-by-case situation here, and I'm not a lawyer, but my intuitions are libertarian, but also I'm not trying to exclude people per se. Like it's in a business's interest to provide its services in exchange for money. So it's like weird to me, like why this would come up. You know, like if it's like a religious group making trouble, like I don't support religious institutions. I would rather support secular activists over religious institutions. So I'm really annoyed that this kind of topic is dividing me and my intuitions. So I guess I'll just stay divided in the middle. 19. Society has not been accepting enough of transgender people. Gaza has not been. If that's your society, the Arabic world has not been very accepting of transgender people. So if you want to talk about Islam, and if that's your society, yeah, it's not accepting enough of transgender people. If you want to free Palestine, there's your lack of acceptance of transgender people. The West, Los Angeles, where I'm at, New York, Berlin. You know, when 3 out of the 4 people at my local Chipotle are trans, I think society is accepting of trans people. 20. Transgender military should not be allowed to serve in the military. Transgender people. Again, like I'm not into these like limitations on access. The military is a government institution, so we're not talking about a private corporation anymore. We're talking about a government-run thing, and everybody should be allowed to join the military. We should be so lucky. If you want to go and die for your country, like go on ahead, you know, like not that most people in the military die, but if you want to go fight wars to defend my way of life, I am very happy that you're doing that. I don't fully rise and applaud at baseball games for military appreciation, but I do appreciate the military, certainly more than I did as a kid, because I value my way of life. I value liberal Western democracies and human rights and party culture and all the like. So if you're trans and you want to go in the military, be my guest. I don't really know why this would not be allowed if women are allowed. You know, certainly the military can figure out ways of establishing camaraderie. I mean, being in the military, being in camp level in the military is not the most private space. So I think people will see you naked. There is hazing, you know, guys go through hazing. Guys have to go easier on girls and trans people, I guess. That's a whole other topic. Bullying in the military, sex crime and molestation in the military. Those are going to be issues, but you should be allowed, and the military needs to just figure it out. I'm going to fully disagree with this. Let's help my score a little bit here to be a little more neutral here at the end. Transgender people are unfairly targeted and harassed by the police. Man, we're really just taking like the woke activist playbook and just swapping out terms, right, for identity groups. Black people are unfairly targeted. Young men are unfair. I mean, young men they're not unfairly targeted. They are targeted by reason. Transgender people, I've not heard of this. I have not heard of this, but I'm sure there are those toxic asshole cops who, you know, spread them, put your arms out, like pat downs like that are extra violent or aggressive to certain people. I'm sure that happens every day. That's not cool. So there needs to be like some regulations and some oversight within policing. That is for sure. Like I'm all in favor of police reform. I don't see how this is a trans issue. I don't really get how trans people are being unfairly targeted. So, but I don't fully know, but I am going to disagree with this because I think it's kind of a ridiculous statement on its face. 22. The state should make sure that a certain percentage of doctors specialize in transgender medical services, and there should be a special certification in transgender medicine. This is going the way of climate change. Climate science didn't used to be such a thing. Meteorology, sure. Certain other things. But climate science is a thing because climate change and the fear around that is a political thing. And so funding goes toward that. And now that's looks to be the argument here. I don't agree with this. I think if you're going to make quotas for what kind of doctors can get licenses and whatnot, you're asking for some trouble. I think people attracted to this kind of medicine are especially cringe. I don't really know. I mean, obviously, if you're transgender, you have a personal stake. But otherwise, like, don't you sometimes wonder, like, why there are male gynecologists or, you know, podiatrists or proctologists? Like, don't you sometimes wonder what kind of person gets into that? Obviously, most people are normal and you kind of fall into it. But there are fetishists. There are butchers and sadists that like to dissect things. Like, fields attract things. Just like police attract some bullies and some sadists, so does medicine. So does teaching for pedophilia, right? Unfortunately, I know it's like an awkward thing to think about, but I'm not sure why you would mandate this kind of thing. Study it, like, make, you know, if you give funding, be my guest and fund whatever you want to fund, research into this stuff or search, like, go ahead. But like, to mandate this, I don't like this state meddling percentages. Like, that's totalitarian. That's authoritarian. That's communist. That's not good. It's not good. I'm going to fully disagree. The group of people who identify as transgender to get attention is larger than the group of people who really are transgender. I don't know. Listening to that excellent podcast series, The Trials of J.K. Rowling, I want to possibly agree with this, but I don't know. The thing is that we've had a huge spike in people who identify as transgender, and it didn't used to be 0, but now it's like really high. It's like around 1%. I don't actually know if it's literally at 1%, but like, that's how little we're talking in terms of social, you know, aggregated numbers. But nonetheless, we've seen a spike of like 3-fold, 5-fold, 10-fold, 20-fold. Like, there's so many more people nowadays that identify this way. And it's always been a thing. It's not like this is like some new thing. And yet it is, right? Because of social media and the way that ideas spread these days. Like, it's a social contagion. So in that sense, I do think this is probably true. And I especially like how it's phrased, people who identify as transgender. That doesn't mean that they actually are transgender. So you have all these like tween girls calling themselves transgender probably, right? So I think those numbers have skyrocketed and that they are doing that to get attention, so to speak. I think that's putting it very flippantly, that you're only doing this to get attention. Like, I wouldn't say that to my kid. But something like that. Some cry for help, some identity crisis, some working through your identity or expression. Like, I did that. I went through that. You know, like the whole punk rock scene that I grew up in the 90s, I was really into skate punk, and Green Day and Blink are my guys at this point. You know, like, I'm just really connected to growing up that way. But when you think about true punk rock values of smashing the state and, you know, living in the gutter and getting tattooed and wearing leather all the time and beating the crap out of certain people, like, I'm not into that, you know. And it turned out that, like, you could argue that I was doing that for, not to get attention, but for other reasons. I wasn't authentically punk, right? And punk is like this subgenre that is very gate kept by true hardcore punks. And it's like, hey, fair enough. If you guys are the true hardcore punks, I'm not that, you know? So yeah, I got into raves and Radiohead and emo. So anyways, I kind of want to agree with this. I don't like how it's phrased though. I'll stay neutral. I'll stay neutral. I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. What you're going through could be very real. I am skeptical though, and I'm allowed to be skeptical. It doesn't mean that I'm full of hate. It doesn't mean that I'm violently judging you. I worry. I worry that some people that I'm aware of in my life have transitioned or began transitioning for the wrong reasons, and that fundamentally they've needed other kinds of help that I wish I could help provide. 24. People who are not transgender should refer to themselves as cisgender as a way to raise awareness. Bullying tactic that's dressed up and sounding polite. Don't tell me that I have to use this new word to describe what 99% of people are. I don't appreciate, like, do you think that, like, little people or midgets demand that the rest of us normies call ourselves, you know, cis height or something? Like, do you see how stupid and preposterous that sounds? Let's raise awareness for how hard it is in the world to be smaller than 4 feet tall. Hey, that is harder. It would be harder to be that short on a day-to-day basis, given how the world is designed for an average height. It would be very hard to be a little person, a dwarf, a midget. I know these are offensive terms, but I want to kind of destigmatize them a little bit. I'm not saying this out of hate, you know? I'm saying this out of, like, let's make light a little bit. Let's bring some levity here. That life is probably very hard, and yet that's the body they're born in. I am sure, have body dysmorphia. I am sure that if your legs are just that tall, you would love the state to invest in the medical technology to make bones grow, or to add, you know, prosthetic limbs that make you height adjusted. Like, I'm sure you would love that, right? It sounds the exact same to me. Like, when people tell me that I have to call myself cisgender and call myself he, him, that's how stupid it sounds to me. And it's not because I'm bigoted. It's not because I don't support trans individuals. I do support people that are describing themselves as trans and doing whatever they're doing, you know, cosmetically, practically, surgically, whatever you got to do what you got to do it. But don't tell me that I have to pay for it. Don't tell me that I have to change my identity. Don't tell me that I have to call you certain things. Like, I'll call you your name. And that's about the level of dignity. I mean, look, I'll call you your pronoun too when I talk about you. But it's difficult for people. It's hard. It's a hard, like, rewiring, and you should be appreciative of that. And the reason it's hard is because we are hardwired to innately understand feminine and masculine traits, and we see that, and we build a mental diagram of that. And to tell us that we're bigoted or wrong or hateful because we do that, and we maybe slip of a tongue, use the wrong pronouns, like, that's so annoying. I fully disagree with this. This is, like, my major point, guys, is that I just don't appreciate the tenor of activism because it's bullying, and I am on your side fundamentally. I want a world in which you live comfortably. I want you to be happy. But don't tell me that I have to be sexually attracted to you. Don't tell me that I need to, you know, change my Instagram bio, that I curate my way for me and my identity. Don't tell me that I have to take on your identity for me. Like, I'm not going to do that. 25. Children aren't old enough to know their gender identity. Children are old enough very, very early to know about their penises and vaginas. It's very natural. It's not this big ploy of, the toy corporations to tell all the boys to play with trucks and all the girls to play with dolls. That is a biologically innate program that boys tend to be drawn toward mechanical things and girls tend to be drawn toward nurturing. It's not society's fault. It's not society's fault. And this whole claim, this is again a ruse that children, they're so young and naive, that. So what do they know about their gender identity? We need to let them figure that out on their own. They know what they have. They know. And there are these exceptions where there's wiring that's crossed up, or there's some other sexual dysfunction, or, some birth defect. And I make room for all that stuff. Look, there are anomalies in the world, and I'm very sympathetic. But what do you mean children don't know? Children know. They are very curious. They care about this. They get into it. Don't you remember being a kid? Someone can be a man or woman. Sorry, I should go back to that last one. I was reading that in this way, this spirit of the indoctrination police coming in and telling us that children don't know, so we should give them time and let them figure it out, and then maybe they'll go this other way. Then there's also this case of children saying, "Daddy, I'm a boy, but I really actually think I'm a girl." In that case, they're confused. They're confused, and that needs to play out, and I'm not in that position. But to my friends and society at large who are in that situation as parents, that's tough. They're obviously confused. And there are trans people. There are. So some kids will actually genuinely have this issue where they don't know. But in general, I think that children know. All right, this is the final question. 2 hours long. Someone can be a man or a woman, even if that is different from the sex they were born with. I will lightly agree with this, as I've described already. So let's finish this up and see what the results are here. All right, so guys, I'm looking here on this transgender attitude test, and I am 37% trans sympathetic, and I'm 63% trans skeptic. 60-40, slightly above. That stands to reason with me. I would describe myself as both of these things, trans sympathetic and trans skeptic. I like the wording there. I think those are appropriate phrases to use. Let's read about it. Trans sympathetic individuals agree with most of the initiatives currently launched by the transgender cause. They tend to see transgender people as a vulnerable and oppressed minority whose well-being is undermined by the prejudice and intolerance of society at large. Since they typically see the non-acceptance and chauvinism of others as a big part of what is holding transgender people back in society, they usually have little patience with people who are trans skeptic and their arguments. Ain't that the truth? They tend to view traditional values as potentially oppressive and constricting for people who fall outside of the usual identity categories in society, and to see emancipation from conventional norms and taboos as an essential component of individual liberty. Look, some of this does ring true. Emancipation from conventional norms, that's all good. Express yourself, girl. And taboos, absolutely. Well, taboos, I'm a little more, I've always been very iconoclastic in my life, but, some taboos make sense. I don't want people to start flinging feces like monkeys, that's a taboo. But yeah, individual liberty, you'll get me there. If you're trying to express your individual liberty, or if you're practicing that, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. Do what you gotta do. But it's very annoying that I'm not allowed to be skeptical. So here we are, trans skeptic, 63% for me. Trans skeptics are people who are skeptical of many of the current initiatives launched by the transgender cause, as I am. Trans skeptics are not necessarily against transgender people and do not necessarily deny that a person may be born with the wrong sex. However, trans skeptics tend to be cautious about valorizing what they see as an unfortunate condition, fearing that it may encourage people who are not actually transgender to identify as transgender in an attempt to get sympathy and support from others. True. Trans skeptics also tend to worry that too many of the initiatives currently associated with transgender advocacy are a threat to traditional lifestyle and morality. Yeah, less so for me, but yeah. And may be a Trojan horse for a broader political agenda, which they do not necessarily agree with. Well, I have to say that those are very well written, both of those paragraphs. And actually, I quite like this test. So there you go, guys. That's the transgender attitude test. I hope you found this fruitful as much as I did. I think it's important to think about these things. And I think my final thought is that you don't have to believe everything that you read. You don't have to think everything you're told. You're allowed to think freely. And I know for some it's harder than others. I think I'm doing that. It's hard for me also. Well, it's not hard for me to think freely. It's hard for me to act and speak freely because I live in my own bubbles of mainly leftists, and I do worry about alienating them with something like this video, which sucks. And I know that some of you are even more so ingrained in a culture, a subculture that demands that you have certain attitudes about certain things. And that sucks too. Like, I really just despise this monolithic thought that's happening right now, that we're sequestered in our silos and that you have to, if you're of a certain milieu, you have to have this opinion about Hamas and this opinion about trans stuff and this opinion about climate. Like, you have to have the exact same opinions. And life's not like that. Like, it shouldn't be like that. It's weird to me that it's like that, and it just shows me that people aren't actually thinking about these topics very well. So I think you're living under a certain brainwashing, to be honest with you. And I don't really want to end on that kind of accusation. I'm sorry to say it like that, if that is putting it too strongly. But I guess I want us to be more open-minded to other people's points of view. And it's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to be skeptical. Like, aren't we supposed to question everything? Including the norms and traditional values, yes, but also the modern causes, I think, deserve questioning. All right, guys, that's it for now. Until next time.